All right, here we go. We got Lila Mansour with us. Thank you so much. Lila, tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, you're I've seen that you're incredibly passionate about law and the protection of everyone, people who come here from Canada, people who are citizens, and social activism. I mean, you're incredibly passionate and a wonderful example of how to participate in your community. Um, what other things are you about that can help listeners understand?
Thank you so much, Robert. That was such a humbling introduction. Thank you. I'm very passionate about so many things. I guess just to begin with a little bit of background about myself, I just graduated from the University of Northern British Columbia. So I'm
Congratulations.
currently, thank you. So I'm currently residing in Prince George, British Columbia, on the unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. So up in the north of British Columbia, where it gets very cold in the winter. And so I graduated in economics, and my plan always was to go to law school. I had a passion from quite a young age, I've got to say 12 or 13, where I did consider the law as a potential career. In addition to other things, I thought of orthodontics and dentistry, and I thought of so many different things. And I always said, no, my passion is in politics and law. And a lot of people say, well, why did you go into economics? And I said, well, I have a passion for math and political science. And I said, the balance there is economics. And I always remember the day where I remember in high school looking up, what degree does Stephen Harper have? Because I want to have whatever he has. And I remember on Wikipedia, and it was like, he has economics. And I said, yes, I'm going to get a degree in economics so I can debate people like him and understand where they're coming from, of course, because I lean more left politically.
Right.
And that was kind of the path, and I've enjoyed my degree very much. Love the mathematical side. I wish I could have learned more about national economics and how it works, but that's just how it is in the program that I was in. And I'm very proud to say that I will be attending law school at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law, at Ryerson University.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. That will begin this fall. And so I'm hoping, my goal and my passion and my life goal is to support newcomers, people from marginalized communities, to access the law. People say, well, what type of law do you want to specialize in? And I said, I want to specialize in the one that people in need the most, whether it will end up being family law or poverty law or wills and estates, or specializing in a few. People say, well, how about human rights? And I said, human rights typically is more on an international scale, and I want to help people locally and just support them, because a lot of people are having difficulties accessing people who either look like them, speak similar language. And so I'm very passionate about access to justice. And so, like you said, why am I so passionate about access to justice? I see a lot of people struggling, a lot of people making mistakes. Of course, the justice system costs a lot, and the people who, of course, are interacting with the justice system themselves shoulder many burdens, including financial burdens, when it comes to achieving justice, whatever the reason may be. And so I hope to help people through that, and I do volunteering with an organization in Vancouver, Justice Education Society, and I support them through their programs to reach newcomers, as well as another organization, particularly for Arabic-speaking newcomers, called Cousins Network. And we do a lot of outreach, and I help support some of the outreach with the community, whether it's legal support or other general information to help newcomers.
Wow. So a question I love asking people is Mark Twain, who's got so many amazing aphorisms. One of the ones he said is, the most important day in a person's, the two most important days in a person's life are the day that they're born and the day they understand the reason why, their purpose. So do you remember, have you always been of this mindset of wanting to help others, or was there a moment somebody helped you in need that you're like, okay, this is what I want to do?
That's a good question. If I have to pinpoint one day, I don't think I can tell you one day in exact, but I guess I'll tell you something that I guess sparked something for me at a young age, and why I really also like politics in addition to law. I remember one day, I think probably my dad was watching a documentary on 9/11. I was probably around 8 or 9 years old at the time. And I had finally come to, it was, it was funny because between 2000 and 2010, I felt people talked a lot about, 9/11, of course, after it occurred in 2001, people thinking about conspiracy theories, people discussing how it could have happened, how it was related to the terrorist groups in the in the Middle East. And I remember watching that documentary, and finally, I think my mom told me that, it's such a big event for us as Muslims because it was people who claimed to be Muslims who committed the attacks. And at that point, I realized, oh, that's why people dislike Muslims so much. I think it was a lot more common for people to use the term terrorist back around 2010. I'm talking 2009. It was much more common. It was something. And so I remember just realizing, wow, people would be afraid of, people of my background. My mom at the time, she wore the hijab. I was young then, so I didn't wear it yet, but I was like, wow, I want to change that. And because I'm an American citizen by birth, I remember saying, I want to become the president of the United States, and I want to change that. I want to change the way that people see Muslims and so on. And I remember people always, compliment my smile. And I always say, when did I start smiling so much? And I said, I think that I just wanted to be such a positive person so that when people saw me as a Muslim woman, they weren't ever afraid. They never saw me as a terrorist or somebody who was ever a threat. Thankfully, I think that's kind of changed. I think people, when they see people who wear the hijab or people from overseas or with darker skin or who look different, I think they look at us, generally as uneducated or backwards or so on and so forth. So I think this idea of terrorists, thankfully, has, I think, in my opinion, died down. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about being as much as I can a role model for other young Muslims, because I grew up in a community where there weren't very many Muslims and I didn't have anybody to look up to. But at the same time, I want to show, be an ambassador for my faith, for my background, and show people that just because I look different or behaves in a slightly different way or have different beliefs, that I can contribute just as much to society. And I want to be in Canada just as much as you and contribute.
Well, I mean, I would argue that perhaps you're doing more than the average person, right? I mean, a lot of people take for granted the privileges that they're given, which is why I've always had such a fascination with why people get offended by terms such as white privilege. Why that they're like, wow, what do you mean, that? And it's like, well, it's not meant to be a slur, right? It's just a truth. It's a truism that because of you don't always know what privileges you have until you're in a situation that where you're like, oh, right. Okay. So that gives me an advantage because that's what a privilege is. So what you want to do is to give back in a way that you can make other people. Oh, Thomas, hello. We just had somebody message us on here to give back in a way that other people can sort of get themselves out of a situation or to be educated in the matters, because when somebody comes here from another country, I mean, okay, so I like to provide illustrations. So my daughter, we're trying to sign her up for swimming lessons, and everything's shut down. So you have to go online and try and book these swimming times. And it was like I was trying to read Greek, right? I couldn't figure this out to save my life. And then I started to think, imagine if I came to this country only knowing another language and everything is in English, and I'm trying to sign up for some sort of bursary or something. It's just like, man, that would be frustrating because you would feel so lost.
Oh yeah, I can tell you a quick story with a problem with a legal kind of issue that I had to kind of help resolve. There was a family, they had signed to extend their rental agreement because they had a notice of eviction and they couldn't find a place in time. And of course, if you get a notice of eviction, you get a free month typically because your landlord is evicting you for some specific reason. And then they had 4 months to find a new place. This was during COVID back in the fall. and they couldn't find a place in time. I think they were set to move into their new place in the new year, but that was, of course, way past the 4 months. I think maybe 5.5 months since the eviction notice had been issued. And then they had signed to extend the agreement, and they didn't realize, of course, because that's, of course, all in the fine print. A lot of legal stuff is in the fine print. Their English isn't very good, and they didn't realize that they had to pay for those. They were forfeiting that free month. And of course, they went and they complained to the tribunal, and they didn't get anything out of it. And yeah, there's lots of stories like this where people are signing things, legal documents, the basic necessities, whether it's rent or food or job, and they don't realize. And I kind of blame the government. They don't encourage these things to be, in big and bold. It's all in the fine print.
Well, I also think that our consciousness of our conscientiousness has really sort of, I mean, it's not where it needs to be, obviously, but it's only in the last few years that we've started to almost look at it from dare I say, like a decolonized lens, like from a lens of, for example, history traditionally was written by whoever won, that sort of expression. But now we're looking at we're trying to implement eclectic perspectives because we realize that different perspectives create a greater understanding. And I think that that's only really started to take over in the last few years. But for example, you mentioned Stephen Harper. There was a guy who really just wanted to keep it in a myopic sort of monocultural lens and made it quite difficult for people to, again, like you say, understand their rights as citizens.
Yeah.
So would you say that the change has been in the last few years, or has this been a super long drawn out process that's nowhere where it needs to be?
I think things are slowly improving. But of course, there's more people like me who want to support people who are having difficulties. We're more willing to have this conversation as a society to discuss the shortcomings, where there's gaps. There's a lot more programs and grants to support people. And Lincoln Alexander School of Law, for example, it's a new law school, and they're very much focused, and they built the entire institution on trying to enhance social justice and choosing students and individuals from whether it's disadvantaged backgrounds, marginalized backgrounds, and building a institution that supports social justice, social and innovation within the justice system to reach more people. And we're seeing that more and more. It's of course slow, and I know we were talking a little bit before about corporate culture. Corporate culture is very difficult to change, and I do blame a lot of corporate culture on what we do see, certain stereotypes that continue to be perpetuated, the way that certain individuals are treated. And so, yeah, there's still a lot of bureaucratic issues, corporate issues that continue to persist, and improvement is slow, but it's coming along. And I'm excited when I see some institutions and organizations, and there are amazing businesses out there that are trying to change. There are politicians that want to look at politics differently, and so I do get excited.
Well, and oh, man, so many good bits there. Corporate culture, and I've heard it said that it's white supremacist culture.
Yeah,
and,
to some extent, and yeah, it can be difficult, especially when we're having discussions about hiring people of color. And we do see organizations hiring people of color, but are they in the highest positions? Are they in the managerial roles? Are they the ones making the decisions? And are they being heard? Because some days I have hit a wall where I felt like I'm trying to support a particular community, and I don't feel like I'm being heard in the needs of the community. So it's tricky.
And like so many great points there again, because have you had a chance to check out this book? See, I told you. No. I try and use my pretentious bookshelf. So this book is amazing, called Diversity Inc. by Pamela
Interesting.
Newkirk, excuse me. And I don't get any proceeds from this. I had to buy that book with my own money. But what she's talking about is how diversity, it makes it look like they're being super inclusive. But you look up the top 10 richest people of the world, they're all white,
all right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Not
Very true.
Not saying that we need to, kill them all or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying, what is real representation, right? When I watch every commercial, and there's, every other commercial has inclusive representation, sort of things like, same-sex marriage, which I'm for all these things. People of color,
I've seen those ads. Yeah.
For all of these things. But in terms of ownership and representation in the managerial aspects, how inclusive is that really?
Yeah. And that's a great question. It's a lot, and I talk about this a lot, tokenism, when I'm having this discussion. A lot of it is tokenism. It's about checking a box, filling a position, making sure that you look a certain way, when in reality, these individuals are not affecting decision making or changing the system, and the people who currently control the system aren't actively trying to change or improve it. And yeah, I do fear tokenism a lot when it comes to whether it's, corporations or organizations, or even government. It's very, we have to be careful of tokenism, because it doesn't help anybody.
And I don't know if we said this while we were recording, but there's this idea of, what did I describe it as? Cultural sort of sharing or whatever, that
yes.
The more inclusive an environment is, it actually makes it for like a better functioning system. And people talk all the time about a meritocracy, which I'm for, but how will you get a true meritocracy if, like, you can't have that with tokenism? And I think that people say things like, well, you should just have the best person for the job. But we all know that, when people are reading resumes, oh, I can't say that name, I'm going to put that on the right pile. There's that piece. So how can you have a meritocracy without there being some sort of legislation that makes things more inclusive? And I don't know if that's there yet either.
Yeah, yes, legislation has been slow, and I'm always hesitant of quotas, because I also consider that another form of tokenism, where we're saying, oh, we need to have 15%, and then, we find that 15%, either a lot of the work gets dumped on them, or they're trying to just find somebody just to fill the spot, and so sometimes that's an issue. Also, I know a lot of organizations are trying to form equity and diversity parts, or like an office, and then they forget that sometimes these people feel overburdened when you're trying to look at racism, and they're trying to solve the problem, because no individual can solve racism within an organization on their own. And sometimes I feel like some of those offices, whether it's an equity and diversity office or some sort of equity office, they'll hire one or two people, and these people get overburdened. And I've found more and more, as I have these conversations with people, that it's actually exhausting to have to continue to justify yourself, to speak for yourself, to stand up for yourself, or you feel you're not represented enough, and you have to always go this like extra mile that other people don't have to. And you do feel some days this sense of exhaustion when others don't understand you. Sometimes for some of my some of the volunteer that I do, people often don't understand that, when you're dealing with people from different community than what you're used to, you have to put in a lot more effort to deal with people within those community. It's a lot more time consuming, and others don't always understand that.
Well, have you ever heard of Daryl? I mean, this might be a bit of a tangent here. And so I'm just going to read this comment that Thomas gave us. Or people coming from other countries, and they have to jump through all these hoops to come to a doctor or nurse when they were right. So he's talking about education.
Yeah.
So actually, just to piggyback off of what Thomas is saying, is I worked at Safeway, and I would do all the shelving and the stocking and stuff. And there was a security guard there, and I was doing this while I was in school, and I was studying for a biology test. And there's a security guard in the break room with me. and he was from Iran, and he was explaining all, because I was like, homeostasis, I don't know, like, and he's explaining it to me in like the easiest way, because I have a thick skull. It takes me a while to figure things out. Anyways, and I was like, oh, this is really cool, man. How did you know all this? He's like, oh, well, in Iran, I was a nuclear physicist, but here I'm a security guard. I was like, holy smokes, right? Like, so he had to change all his credentials. It just became so, like, he came here with his family. How is he going to update his courses? I mean, and that's a huge problem, right? Because we have these highly educated people in high standing in their country, and then they come here and it doesn't, like, how do we solve that issue?
I think that there's two parts to this issue. Firstly, of course, we've all heard of that example where there's a taxi driver who's a doctor. That's a common example that gets pulled up when we're talking about this problem. And so the first part is just having additional support. So there's a lot of people that do reach out to me, say, I'm an engineer, I'm a lawyer. What do I do to upgrade my skills here in Canada? And a lot of time I don't have an answer. I said, I'm sorry, you're going to have to look into that yourself, because I first of all, I've never had to go through that process. But second of all, it's actually a very tiring and exhaustive process as an individual. It's not something I could Google and give you an answer in 20 minutes. It depends on your credentials. And I think that the government could solve a lot of these problems by, having a lot more translated materials. This is something that I've actually faced, particularly during COVID-19, when I'm trying to support people in Arabic. And I'm like, why are there, like, you brought many refugees, that there are lots of newcomers from the Arab world who speak Arabic. Why isn't there more translated materials? It just seems like common sense. And what's even more surprising is I find that the translation is also off, which is very shocking, because they say, we hire a third party to do translation for us. And I said, well, then why is the translation incorrect? There are people who are, willing to do this. So that's one thing I would probably suggest, is the government just provide more resources to help people and make the process a little bit easier for these individuals, whether it's providing, upgrading for their English. And a lot of people actually come with strong English skills, and they just, need the certification. And so I think it's up to the government to make the decision to be able to support people to get their licensing quicker and faster, upgrade their skills, whatever is needed for them to be able to practice here in Canada. Secondly, I would say the other side of the story is look at the countries that they're coming from and the issues that continue to persist that are a result of Western nations meddling in things within those regions, whether we're looking at the Middle East or Africa. Why are people wanting to leave there? They know that there's no opportunity. There's either war, a lot of different issues that we know either are a result of Western actions, long-standing impacts of colonialism, etc. And so those are kind of the two sides of the coin, that governments in the West who are receiving these newcomers need to support them in adapting to their new country, but also stop meddling and causing conflict elsewhere.
And that's such a big, like, the stop meddling piece. It's almost like, here I go way off on a tangent again. Thank you for your patience with me. But the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire, the reason, it's one of the many reasons, which I see parallels between the fall of the Roman Empire and another empire, which I will not name. But you can read between the lines there. It as long as an expanding empire is easier to upkeep than a stable empire. And going back to your meddling piece, as long as Western powers keep kind of mucking about in other people's business, it keeps their economy going. Right? Exactly. In a very strange way. I mean, we only need to look at the war in Iraq to understand that, Saddam Hussein was like anti-religious. Right? He would have nothing to do with Muslim extremists. Yeah. Just given what he did during the Gulf War, right? Yet they went in there thinking that there was weapons of mass destruction. Like, you can't. And right when they did that, the world was like, okay, like you're not even trying to hide it anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas before in the 80s in the Cold War, they were able to hide things under the guise of the fear of communism. But
Yeah.
nowadays things are getting harder to hide, but you have to kind of maintain it. And if we're just to stop and kind of, you know, focus on ourselves, there's going to be great difficulties there.
Yeah. Yeah. They
And
profit off of fear, right? They profit, and
exactly.
politicians thrive off of that fear.
Well, what like xenophobia is the fear of others, you know, other groups, other nationalities, et cetera, et cetera. And what do you think are the number one fears that people with xenophobia have? And I'll tell you what I think mine are. It's a
Okay.
fear of resources, and it's a fear of, you know, jobs or well-being being taken from them.
Yeah.
As artificial and as, you know, inaccurate as that can be, that's what I seem to think are the fears that xenophobic people have, is that resources will be taken away, or taxes will be affected, and jobs will be taken away. What would you say are the contributing factors of xenophobia?
I would say the two that you have mentioned, and people for some reason also they worry about their own culture and their identity. So they'll see certain people coming in. Let's say, let me give you an example. I often did hijab for a day at the university. And so people would come and try on the hijab. And I know for a fact that somebody who is xenophobic, who doesn't like what I do, they'll be like, well, you're bringing your culture, you're brainwashing other people to be like you want to make everybody wear that thing on their head too. So it's not, that doesn't come down, of course, to resources or jobs. It's just them, being afraid to either become the minority, for
Right.
their traditions and habits to get pushed to the side, and others get attention. So there is this more cultural aspect, because I do strongly believe that people are afraid that their resources, their tax money is going to support people who don't deserve it, or their jobs are going to people who are coming from other countries, which of course we know time and again that immigrants and newcomers contribute to our economy, make it stronger, better. Everything points to that, but at the same time, people are worried just about culture, and they don't want to become the minority.
And you know what? That's amazing point, because that one can't be overlooked. And I think
Mm-hmm.
for myself, I've often said, like, I don't even know what my culture is exactly, because I'm
Mm-hmm.
technically I'm the dominant culture, right?
Yeah.
So I always implore people who they're like, I don't really know my culture. Go to a country where you look, oh, hello, Forgettable Vendetta. Wonderful person. Yes, go to a country where you are the minority, and you'll
Mm-hmm.
find out very quickly what your culture is. I went to Barbados when I was like 26,
Mm-hmm.
loved it, but just right off the bat, I got in the cab, and I always like sitting in the front of cabs because I don't like sitting in the back. I feel like there's a weird, like I like to sit beside the
I'm
guy.
the opposite. I'm definitely the opposite.
And I like to sit and gab. Of course, COVID, now I have to sit in the back. But anyways, I sat in the car. When I sat in there, I was looking at the steering wheel, and the cab driver sat beside me. He's like, well, where are we driving to? But that's it right there, right? Like, different culture, different way of doing things. And I didn't look like anybody else. I had a friend who that's his culture, and he was showing me around, and I was not a tourist. And I
Mm-hmm.
was so thankful for it, because it helped me understand just how difficult it is for somebody coming here,
Mm-hmm.
and they are a stranger in a strange land.
Yep.
Did you ever read that book? It's a picture book without any words, and I think it's called The Arrival. Have you heard of this one?
No, I've not. And what are the
Oh,
pictures? What is?
so it's about somebody who escapes their country for, it seems like there's a dictator in power or something. So they escape their country and they come into a new one, but then people are speaking in like weird symbols and stuff. It's a really cool book to
Interesting.
help kids, because I'm a school teacher, or I work in schools, to help them understand, to remove the stigma of the other. Because Edward Said talked a lot about othering.
Mm-hmm.
and this idea of we like to exoticize and almost fetishize other cultures,
Oh, yes.
but only do it in ways that we like, and it's like, here's a good one, that all black people are good at basketball. Like that's othering right there.
Exactly.
Prime example. Or that
Mhm.
people other me, they think, like, I interview people all over the world and they're like, oh, you must love hockey. And I'm like, I am the worst hockey player you've ever met. Right.
Yes.
Which is
No.
cute. I mean, it's hockey, but my point is that
Yep.
we do that, right?
All cultures do that. I mean, if I were to talk about the
Yeah.
Middle East or some of the stuff that I sometimes hear from my parents, people, idolize, for example, Europeans or people with white skin, light hair, blue eyes, and they just idolize them and put them on a pedestal, for example. Yeah, we do that. And then we put others down and see others beneath us if they have darker skin. And it's just so unfortunate, and that's very interesting to hear that and I'm glad that there's more children's books discussing this and encouraging youth to look beyond their horizons, to understand that the world is a very, very diverse place. Because I think growing up, I grew up, I'm living in a predominantly quite conservative, quite white community, and so I didn't see people like me growing up. Books were definitely not like me. It's funny because a lot of these things kind of get internalized as you're growing up. And I remember in grade 4, there was a teacher who would sometimes teach. One year she would teach about the explorers, Christopher Columbus, all of the great European explorers. And another year she would teach Indigenous studies and about all the different First Nations groups, so on and so forth. And it was always, for some reason, amongst the students, it would be so amazing if you were in her class the year that she was teaching the explorers. And for some reason we kind of idolized them as young people, and learning about First Nations or Indigenous cultures was something not as important or as interesting. And so it's interesting that these sort of ideas get shaped in your mind from a young age from young students. It's so fascinating how much you can influence the way people will think in their adulthood by the way that they are taught as youngsters. And you probably have so much experience with that.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, we're all just like, it's like the caterpillar that becomes the butterfly, but he was always a caterpillar. You know what I mean? Like, we're all still children. We're just extensions of that. I'm a 31-year-old child, right? But yet we learn all these things as we go, and we're like, oh, okay, I have to, there's a corporate culture again. I have to 9 to 5 and look like an adult. But then you get on these Zoom meetings and you see all these goofy things that are happening, and you're like, we're still just human. And maybe that's why I love education, for one, is that kids are like, they fall over, they get back up, right? Although I'm starting to see in our society, and this is kind of sad, that kids are becoming more and more kind of perfectionists. I don't know. It's a battle between that, but
it is a battle. Yeah.
I love kids that make mistakes. Now you were talking about, you were born in Chicago, you moved to Quesnel, which is a small community, and then you moved to, Prince George, right?
Prince George, exactly. Yeah. Been here ever since I was 7.
Yeah. So again, I've never even been to Prince George. What was it like growing up in a community like that and being a Muslim?
Yeah, that's a great question that I like to reflect on a lot. And I've honestly come a long way as an individual and we as a community. My parents are Syrian, of course. And so we were for a very long time the only Syrian family in the community. Though there were some that came and went, we were the only visible one. I never had a Syrian friend, honestly, until I met, some along the way as refugees were coming, Syrian refugees were coming to Canada. That was kind of some of my first encounters with Syrians in Canada. So it was a very interesting experience. But growing up as a Muslim in Prince George, it was a strong part of my identity. I think saw myself as Canadian, but I also saw myself actively as a Muslim. We didn't have a mosque for a lot of the time, and I remember growing up, there would be prayers either in a prayer hall or in a basement of a church. And we were very thrilled to finally be able to establish and have a mosque built in 2011. I watched my parents and many people within our small community of a couple hundred work together to fundraise funds. I remember my parents and I, we would travel and they'd go to big fundraisers to fundraise money to build the mosque. So that was in 2011. And ever since, we've seen the community grow. Probably, I want to say, has somewhat doubled since 2011, and it's beautiful to see the young children and to see people growing up. But I didn't see a lot of people that looked like me growing up personally, which is why I was so passionate about being a role model and setting a good example, because there wasn't very many people before me that I could look up to. I consider myself to some extent a trailblazer within my community, which is something that's very exciting, but also carries a lot of responsibility. Of course, can be very tiring some days. And of course, because I'm leaving my community for law school, sometimes I worry and I say, I hope that there will be youth that will continue to carry on and represent the Muslim community within our small community. So yeah, that's kind of my experience growing up Muslim in Prince George. It was always being the odd one out. But when we would go to the mosque, we would definitely feel a sense of community. That's when you could finally feel who you were and feel your identity and say, I am a Muslim. But I've been really fortunate over the years. I feel like I've, as an individual, I've become more confident. So I have hosted events. I remember just before COVID, it was beginning of March of last year, we held Meet Your Muslim Neighbor at the university and Hijab for a day. And we introduced people to the faith and who we were. And I feel a lot more comfortable talking about who I am as a Muslim, who I am as a person, individual who's Canadian, but of Syrian origin. I feel much more comfortable talking about those things now. And I hope that young people feel that way as well. But I'm not sure if I feel this way because I'm just much more confident as an individual within my community, or if it's because I feel like it's become somewhat more normal as well for us to talk about who we are and not be afraid of talking about our own race or ethnicity or religion.
Wow. I mean, I can only imagine how much resilience, you've developed over the years, in having to work through this. Because
it's definitely difficult. And there are youth that definitely struggle with their identity, and we have to support one another when it comes to that.
Yeah. Well, and that's such a wonderful thing that you're able to sort of, there is kids that they have each other and they have their families, of course. But like you say, you were the only one growing up. So I imagine you had to, you must be very close with your parents.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Because they helped you navigate all this, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the fact that I can speak Arabic is really thanks, especially to my mom, but to both of my parents, because people get surprised, and even I'm surprised some days that I have, strong conversational fluency, despite growing up with very few Arabs around me or having conversations growing up. And so a lot of that was, by watching television shows in Arabic and having conversations with my parents. And so I'm very, very thankful for that. And not everybody, not all parents can pass on the language to their children. And sometimes it's up to the child as well to be encouraged and to want to learn, because not every child is going to end up taking the language or the culture with them. And I think I was just very passionate about that because I felt it as a very strong part of my identity growing up.
Well, and I think that in society, I mean, we seem to all understand Christianity because of, its role in getting Western countries to where they are. But not a lot of people understand the Muslim faith, and that, again, Muslim is like Christianity includes Catholicism, Protestantism, Anglicanism, all these different sects, right? And the Muslim faith is the same. It's not just one way of doing it. And I think that can be a bit of a, people who don't know much about it, they might think that, right? Whereas
Yeah, exactly.
It's like anything. Now, you touched a little bit about Islamophobia at the beginning. Have you seen like an increase or a decrease in that, or is it kind of the same way that it is?
That's a good question. I have to admit, I mean, I've been particularly a young person for majority of my life so far, and people say once you go out and you work and you see a lot more of corporate culture, they said you're going to see a lot more than what you've seen, because of course I had a regular life, go to high school, and probably started seeing more things once you go to university and you start working, and you see comments on social media. I think now people have really resorted to social media, I think, to vent or express their anger, or of course, to be racist. And so whether I think that there has been a decrease, it's tough to say until we return in person. And I hope that through the Black Lives Matters movement that we've had and that continues to persist, and that movement is so important for supporting not just Black individuals and ending anti-Black racism, but I think that it's been something positive for all communities of color and all people of all backgrounds. And I'll have to wait until we go in person to see if there has been a change and a shift. But I think online, I think it's still like it was, if I want to say 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And I know I spoke in Parliament back in 2019. I spoke particularly about Islamophobia. And I know that there were definitely lots of comments afterwards, Islamophobic comments after that, of course. So people like to go online and do their thing. And like I said, until I can go in the real world and see a lot more people, I think people are a lot more subtle. They've learned to be more subtle. But there's, of course, people who are very outright, will say whatever they want. So,
yeah. Well, who I was going to mention a little bit earlier was a guy named Daryl Davis. Have you ever heard of him?
no, I have not.
This guy's unreal. He's heavy metal. He's a Black musician who is down south. And one day he was performing, live, and this guy came up to him and said, "Man, you're really good." This like big white guy. And he's like, "Oh, thanks, man." He's like, "No, man, like you're really good. Like I didn't know that you could play like that." And the guy's like, What do you mean by that?" And he's like he actually was like, what do you mean by that? Like, well, like Black people or whatever. Turns out this guy was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, this white guy.
Wow.
And he tells him this. He tells Daryl Davis this. He's like, yeah, I because he was brainwashed into thinking this. And then Daryl Davis, so he gave him, this white guy gave Daryl Davis his uniform, the hood thing. And he's like, yeah, no, and the point is that he developed a relationship with this individual that completely destroyed his preconceived notions, his stereotypes of what the Black community is. And I think that that's the key for things like, Islamophobia and racism and stuff. It's like, well, how many people do you know of that group that you seem to know so well? Right.
Very true. Very true. It's usually these sort of interactions that end up happening that change people. They have a neighbor that, perhaps Black or Muslim or Indian, and then they see their kindness or something, and they have a change of heart, and they realize that their preconceptions were, of course, way further than the truth. It's these sort of experiences, I think, that are very, very valuable. And we have to continue to push for open spaces, for dialogue, for interaction. And I hope that once COVID is over, because it's very difficult online, it's very difficult to reach these sort of people. There's people that we will never be able to change the way that they think. They are too isolated, and it's just impossible to reach them. And it would be a waste of our time to try to interact with them. And it could, endanger our own safety. But hopefully after COVID, we can have those face-to-face interactions, because online has been draining, and it can be difficult to have some of those dialogues, but I think some of them have been as well very valuable.
Yeah. And again, to your point, I mean, anti-racism is the idea that there's no such thing as a superior or an inferior culture. It's just, there's different cultures.
Yeah.
And different cultures bring different things to the table. And the other piece there too, sort of piggybacking off of that, is this idea that what's the difference between tolerance and acceptance? And a friend of mine, brilliant guy, he told me that tolerance is the idea that no one's rights or freedom should be impeded upon because of who they are, right? But acceptance is different. You can't just, some people will never accept LGBTQ plus, but they have to tolerate them. They can't hurt them. Like, okay, fine. Maybe you'll never understand why. Not that it's, it's not their job to explain it to you, but we have to have tolerance in society. People have to be safe. And then acceptance comes. But I think when you try to create mandatory acceptance of things, or which its extension can become cancel culture, I think it actually creates the people double down on their wacky thoughts, right? So, for example, if you had somebody who said, "Oh, to be a conservative nowadays is like to be a Jewish person in 1939 Germany," and it's like, that is in no way comparable, right? That's in no way comparable. But why can't we maybe let's have a conversation with this person and try to understand where this is coming from and why they're saying it before we just take them out back and, get rid of them.
Yeah.
But when we just say, okay, that's it, you're done. Meanwhile, this is an organization that doesn't have a whole lot of multiculturalism at the top end. It's sort of like, are you just doing that just to look good, or what's the goal here? And I think that educational measures versus punitive measures will work far better in the long run. But what I do want to say is that it's not a Muslims person, LGBTQ plus person, Black person, etc., to explain their culture. That's not their job, right? So if you have a single Black person in your organization, it's not your job it's not their job for them to explain the significance of the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin trial, right?
Very true.
That's a job for Google. You should try that, right? And I just think that as a society, we need to be okay to ask questions, but we should try and do a little bit of homework before we ask those questions.
Oh, yeah, I absolutely agree with you on all of those points. Yeah, it's so important for us to be open-minded, to be willing to learn from others. But I guess to some extent I might say I disagree, because I do encourage, Muslims to say, to go out and share your thoughts with people, because some people, just don't know.
Right.
In a system where, we know all the main Christian holidays, Christmas, Easter, whatever. It's up to us as a Muslim community to make sure that people know what Eid is, that we tell people about it, that we aren't ashamed, and that we push for our own celebrations, for example, so that others are at least aware. Because I'm not going to expect my white friend to know, one of my friends, in university, to know about all of my faith. I would expect her at least to have, at the very least, respect, and, like you said, hopefully acceptance. But I think that as an individual, it's my job to tell them about, my culture or my religion. But I think where we don't need to justify or educate others is when it comes to like race. Those things don't require any sort of explanation. I don't need to as a Black individual doesn't need to explain themselves or educate. There's nothing that they need to educate others. That's, as somebody from the Middle East, as an Arab, I don't need to educate others about my race or my ethnicity, because those are just things that we are born with, and we have to learn to understand. We have to be willing to learn. But when it comes to cultures and things like that, religions, there's a lot out there. And sometimes it's nice to come to the source, I think, with a lot of those things. And that's where a lot of misconceptions, I think, happen when it comes to culture and religion. Those sort of things, I think there's a lot of false information out there. And it's nice to just come back to the source. And so I do encourage my Muslim brothers and sisters who do feel comfortable to share their experiences, to help educate others. Because that's the only way that we can really support one another, support people who have the wrong type of thinking. And we all know the Facebook algorithm filters things to the things that we want to see. And so it's nice to often see a different perspective.
Yeah. You know what? That's Thank you for not agreeing with me on everything. I love that.
Maybe just the one thing. Except
No,
everything else, Robert.
but that's a good point, because
Mhm.
it's like I could say to somebody, ask me anything, but I can't answer. Like, I can't answer something that I'm
Mhm.
not a direct member. Like, I know about,
Very true.
Rumi, the poet Rumi, and
Mhm.
but I don't practice the Muslim faith. So I'm not the person that one should ask on that, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So but I think that that's a great sort of segue into, this idea of how do we create healthy conversations for people who want to know things,
Mhm.
and as long as the emphasis is on education and understanding, my belief is that only good can come from it. And the
I
other
agree.
thing is that we might ask questions that are like, I know that this is a really dumb question, but, well, thank you for asking it, right? And
Mhm.
and and
Mhm.
and by that being answered, and it can kind of put a person at ease. But again, it's like,
Mhm.
let's make sure that who's answering these questions, like you say, is somebody who's they
Has
have
some
that
knowledge,
connection.
right?
Yeah,
Experience.
yeah,
I like a moderation as much as possible. So when we're engaging in these dialogues, you don't want to be aggressive. You don't want to argue with individuals. We want to be as peaceful as possible when we're having these sort of interactions and conversations. Of course, any sort of discrimination, racism, hate speech,
yeah.
homophobia, Islamophobia, xenophobia, whatever, anti-Semitism, anti-Asian hate, I can list them all. But none of those sorts of things should ever be tolerated or accepted in those sorts of conversations. But still, it's our jobs as people who want to educate and have understanding to come from a place of also understanding that
Mm,
these individuals may have been taught to think this way for decades, and they may have grown up in a very white community. They've never seen person of color, and so they're having this first interaction, and so we have to be patient with them, of course, but we expect, of course, the same. We expect
yes,
respect, and that sort of thing.
reciprocity.
So it's really difficult to navigate, and sometimes we just have to be patient. And each individual that I may interact with or have a conversation with, I know one woman, she couldn't wrap her head around why I wear the hijab. She could not accept that a woman has to cover her hair. And I explained to her, I did my job to explain why I wear the hijab, and she can go on her way as long as she doesn't try to intrude on, my freedom of expression to wear whatever I like. But I've done my job, and it's up to her in the end whether she, wants to accept what I practice and do. So, yeah.
Well, and the other thing is, here I go on my weird little anecdotes. But for
That's
example,
great.
Pamela Anderson was against the seal hunt, right? And was like, they're killing seals, and what was happening is the Inuit, that's what they do. That's part of their way of life.
Hmm.
Because it's very cold up there. It's very difficult to grow crops. So they live off of seals. And Pamela Anderson was saying, like, how could they do this? So what I'm getting at here is there was some virtue signaling, saying that this way is the right way. And I think for something like the hijab, for say Westerners, is they think they're trying to understand something through their lens, not through the person whose culture that is, who's participating in that action, their lens. They may see, for example, may think that, oh, they have to do that. They don't have a choice. And that's not true. I mean, you talk to, you know, people who wear the hijab, what they say, it's like, no, I choose to wear this. What is this now? Here's my silly question, but what is the significance of the hijab? My understanding is it in some cultures, I think the turban in the Sikh culture kind of keeps sin away or something like that, or bad energy away. What's the
Yeah,
significance of the
it's
hijab?
not a silly question at all. It's a very
Yeah.
legitimate question, and I encourage people to always ask me. I've had conversations with Sikhs who wear the turban as well. It's funny because when I held hijab for a day last year, it was my table with all the hijabs and the young women who were helping me, and then just across from us on the other side of the hall were a whole bunch of Sikh individuals who are running a turban table and encouraging people to put on the turban. And so we had, a very wonderful exchange between each other's and conversations, and we share a lot of commonalities. But for the hijab itself, if you ask each woman, they will give you probably a slightly
Mhm.
different response, but more of the greater, broader picture. It's a symbol of modesty. It's obedience to God as a woman. Mostly just very much modesty and really women being in control of who gets to see their beauty, who gets to see their bodies. And like I said, modesty, respect for women so that women aren't judged by the way that they look. It's people often argue with me about this, but I feel very strongly when it comes to wearing the hijab and controlling who gets to see my my body or my beauty, because if social media has really shaped how women are supposed to look, how they're supposed to appear. They're often, if you were to watch any TV show honestly, and you see that the way that women are portrayed or how their appearance is supposed to give them some sort of additional power. And I have nothing against women who choose to show their bodies and who like to celebrate their beauty. I have nothing against that. What I am absolutely against is corporate culture or the media advertising that uses women's bodies so negatively to influence how others see women, how others want to shape how women are supposed to look or supposed to dress. I know a lot of young women struggle with body image and how they're
Yeah.
supposed to look, and how the models and how it just influences them. And I'm like totally against that. We don't see the same thing when it comes to men. We just don't. And so I just have this personal frustration, I guess, when it comes to how women are portrayed everywhere, whether it's in advertising or in the media. And I personally believe that my hijab gives me that power to choose and dictate how people see me, and I don't have to live up to a certain standard.
I'm very glad I asked that question.
I hope that it gives you some clarity. I hope my answer was clear.
I mean, after that answer, I don't see how anyone could, what
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there's, how about that for a value statement? I don't see
Yeah.
how anybody couldn't understand that. Like that's,
Yeah.
but anyways, I really don't. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And you're absolutely right that we live in a society that there's a lot of pressure on men too, actually, because
Mm-hmm.
I say this sometimes, but I had an eating disorder when I was like 14,
Wow.
15,
Mm-hmm.
because I looked at all the people in Hollywood and they're all ripped and jacked.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, if I shave my chest, I should look like that.
Right.
And I'm joking, but there's a lot
Yeah.
of pressure on young people
Mm-hmm.
to look and act in certain ways that, like you say, go against, I think, their virtues, their values,
Yeah.
right?
And it ruins, I mean, their happiness. So there's a lot of people who are
100%.
consumed in just thinking about, do I look good enough? Do I look like that person? It's like, well, we have to have this understanding, first of all, that a lot of what we see is either filters or Photoshop, and it's just a lot of pressure, and people think that they have to look a certain way to be approved of, and it's like, no, you should look the way that you want to look. And we need to stop putting pressure on people, whether it's a woman or men or girls or boys, or people who don't associate themselves with either gender, of course, to be able to express themselves in the way that they feel most comfortable.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the people who don't see themselves as either gender, because
Mm-hmm.
for me, that's always one that I kind of, it's mine to struggle with. It's
Yeah.
not for anybody else to, what I mean, adjust to
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
that's a good point, is that again, gender is something that is kind of what's the word that I'm looking for? Not assimilated, but what's it called when something is, it just, gender is something that one could easily argue is indoctrinated in us
Right.
by the messages of society, right? Yes, you're born, an individual can be born with certain biological parts, but the roles associated to those parts that they take on can be of indoctrination. And I totally get that. You just have to go to Toys R Us to understand that, right?
Yeah.
Because I have a
exactly.
20-month-old daughter and she loves cars, and it's like, keep loving cars, kid. Like, like what you want to like, because that's what makes you awesome.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, gender stereotypes, I think is definitely an issue, and it affects, a lot of people who see, okay, I am, I choose, let's say, to identify as a woman. People, and even this is an issue with people back home, and they say, you're a woman, you have to act a certain way, or you need to be a certain way, or you're a woman, you need to stay home. So yeah, we have to be, very, very careful. And like, I know we were having a conversation about individual versus community, and when it comes to these things, let the individual decide.
Yeah, and let it not be at the sacrifice of their community, right?
Exactly.
Like,
It shouldn't be something that's causes people to cut off connections, or
yes.
Yeah.
To keep your identity, right? Which, to me, identity, I'm associating that to the community, right? To keep your community identity as well as your individual identity. I mean, that's what that's balance in life. Wow. Thank you for bringing that up. Now the last bit, and I can't believe we're already at an hour here, because
It's been a great conversation. Wow.
But you wanted to speak about the Middle East, and I know that we would need many more hours to speak about this, but this is something that you're incredibly passionate about, and one that I'm passionate about in terms of rethinking how we think the other, right? Edward Said talked about this extensively, and for example, the term third world country. What does that mean? I would ask my teacher, well, what's a second world country? And
Are there second world countries? Do we don't, I've never used that term or seen it heard. Is there second world countries?
Well, and I would ask that, and they would be like, Canada. Anyway, like, they wouldn't have really an answer.
Yeah, they don't.
So which tells you how problematic the term is on the get-go. But the idea that developing countries and developed countries, how did that country become developed? Now, obviously, I know where that comes from, but I'm hoping that you can kind of touch on, the Middle East and why you're so passionate about that subject.
Yeah, just a touch. In addition to my economics degree, I have a minor in international studies. I love international studies, learning about how international systems work, global governance systems. I strongly see myself as a global citizen, and I'm fortunate, of course, to identify as American, Canadian, and on top of that, Syrian. It's a beautiful part of my identity. And I'm so passionate probably about the Middle East. I became more passionate about the Middle East as I saw, of course, the uprisings occurring in Syria. Like I said before, I am Syrian in origin, and seeing people fighting for their freedom, fighting against a dictator, it was a really beautiful thing. And I know that there are people who continue to fight, and a lot of people have been unfortunately displaced, all because of a dictator who doesn't want to, doesn't want to resign, doesn't want to hold a proper election, doesn't want to have an opposition. It's so frustrating. And so you really have to understand, I think, the Middle East as a whole, and I guess all regions of the world that have ever been colonized, and understand that those regions are nothing like what they are today. The entire Middle East, there was nothing like a country or borders. I mean, before that, there was the Ottoman Empire, but that was huge. And people didn't really, if you, and I know I said this earlier, but if you went to the borders of all of the countries in the Middle East, whether you were on the border of Syria and Iraq, you'll realize that people speak very, very similar accents on the borders, because those borders just were never there. It was just people. People were, whether they were in tribes or villages or neighborhoods. And so, of course, when we saw colonialism in, between World War I and World War II, and then finally a lot of those borders were drawn out and eventually those states claimed independence, I think that the Middle East after that was changed forever. I don't think that I always wonder what would have happened if there was no colonialism in the Middle East. What would it look like? Because the entire region was just one. People saw themselves. I know that they called the region, especially Palestine, Syria. That's just entire region from Iraq, everywhere. It was just, they called them Bilad al-Sham. And it was, people saw themselves as part of that. People lived in their own villages. And then came along the nation state. And I think that it's been problematic. We've seen, I don't know if the region was ready for centralized power, like a president. And then, of course, these presidents get supported by external or Western powers, and they just continue to gain so much influence and power over their people. They turn into autocracies and dictatorships, and so many issues that continue to persist because of, I think, colonialism. And of course, there's issues in the region. There's always issues wherever you go. But I think colonialism has really exacerbated those long-standing problems. And I honestly, I don't think that Western nations or the United States is very serious about supporting democracy anywhere outside of the West. I don't think that it's very serious about supporting countries in reaching democracies. I think that sometimes the West thrives off of these sorts of powers because they can either manipulate them or get what they want. They can take control of oil, whatever resources, whatever they're there for. And so, it can be very frustrating. And then on top of that, of course, we've seen the things that have been occurring in Palestine, Israel, and the displacement of people that continues to persist. And I continue to be surprised that there are people that will continue to remain silent in the wake of the continued displacement and mistreatment of the Palestinian people from their land. It's frustrating.
Well, and what like you said, I mean, borders are like, that's the purest form of an idea, of a human idea, right? Because you go to space and you don't see the 49th parallel. Although when you actually can kind of see borders from space is at nighttime, because you see the lights.
True.
But the reason why you see that is because one particular region is more disenfranchised than the other region. And again, that goes back to who's influencing who, and shareholders and things like that.
Exactly. Very true.
And I think is it Rudyard Kipling? Richard Kipling? He wrote the Jungle Book, but he also talked about the white man's burden, and this idea of, you need to go to these countries and you need to teach them the Christian values and take them from their human savagery, words to that effect. And like in all things, the road to hell is paved in misdirections. It's good intentions, is the saying, but the idea that maybe he was sincere and earnest when he said this, but the end result was it has been catastrophic. It's continued to destabilize that region. And like you said, I mean, think about the Pakistan-India border, and I think it was like in the 50s when they drew that through. They obviously, whoever drew this line, they didn't do their homework, nor did they care, obviously, that they were separating. And the same thing happened in Canada and America, like the Blackfoot Nation. It went, the 49th parallel went right through them. So families were literally separated. And when they would cross the border, they'd say, "Okay, what's your nationality?" "Oh, I'm Blackfoot." And they're like, "What? Are you Canadian or are you American?" "I'm Blackfoot," right? And anyways, it's just like you say, these borders are like, but what do you do now, right? It's like, do you get rid of them, or somebody actually answered a question that I asked beforehand, forgettable vendetta. It's wonderful. This person helps me out a lot. So they shared that the first world included the United States and its capitalist allies, and the second world was the communist Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies. So there you go. There's a judgment statement by making it first, second, third. And then third world was all the other countries that were not actively aligned on either side. So these were often impoverished former European colonies. There you go.
Very helpful. Yeah. We try to stay away from those words in academia because we try to use developing, but I think it's best just to say the regions that you're talking about, right? Like,
yeah. What is the name of the country that you're talking about?
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. Because you're right. These are value statements. And, if you go to some of these, well, for example, I think Denmark which is a developed country, but anyways, is the happiest country in the world.
I've heard that.
What does that mean? Does that mean that it has the lowest deaths to mental illness? Right?
Yeah, no idea. This could be some arbitrary happiness measure survey.
Right. So what I'm saying is developed so great. Yeah, right? Like there's these virtue and value statements associated to the economic
well-being
characteristics of a nation, right? So because I know that in a friend of mine, he traveled Iraq, and he said, "Yeah, man, I would talk until like 3 a.m. about some of them, people in Iraq, these communities, and it was like I was family." Meaning that we talk about, what is it, Southern mannerisms or whatever. Anyways, the mannerisms of Iraq, like in the South, like Southern United States, like, oh, he's got that Southern hospitality. And he was in Iraq. He was saying how hospitable the people were there. He said that he smoked maybe 3 packs of cigarettes in the night. But again, like that's not like characteristic of all Iraqi people. But the fact is that he felt more welcome there than he did in other places in the world.
Yeah,
and maybe that's something that we can pull from it, right? Like,
yeah, that sense of community. Because I know you were talking earlier about individual versus the community. What are the building blocks of society? And of course, I'm an individual who believes strongly in family and community, and we have to find that balance, especially. I think here in Western society is becoming a lot more individualistic, and there are pros, of course, to supporting the rights of the individual, but there, of course, has to be a balance with the rights of a family and community and society, and looking out for the well-being of others as well. And I know you brought up the example, of Middle Eastern culture, trying to be very hospitable, support one another. People, if you give a container, they say that a container of food, there's this idea that you should never return it to the owner without it being full of something as well as a gift of return. And it's something very beautiful. But of course, there always has to be a balance, because sometimes, people will take advantage of this. They're like, "You're my family member, you need to work for me for free, or we're from the same community, therefore you need to provide me services for free or do something for me as a favor." And this is like, no, we also have to respect that people have individual rights. They have to be respected. And so we have to find that balance. And I don't think there's any perfect country in the world, but I think that at least here at home, we're drifting away from that importance of community and family and society and supporting one another sometimes. But I know that during COVID, many of us have tried to come together to support one another. And it's been a time where we realize we cannot live alone. We cannot live as individuals and survive on our own.
We are societal creatures, and we are enriched when we are enriched by diversity. That's what I mean. That's what I truly believe, that it makes us stronger, not weaker. that being
I
said,
absolutely agree.
in the adjustment period of that, it can make it seem, oh man, it was said so beautifully in this book I recently read, but it can seem like oppression to change can seem like oppression to the privileged because it's not what they're used to. Something like that. I'll try and send you the word, but it was from this book called Vibrate Higher.
Oh,
Yeah, amazing
never
book
heard
by
of it.
Talib Kweli. He's a hip hop artist, amazing guy. But anyways, he was saying that when these changes happen, it can seem like the privileged elite classes are being oppressed when really it's just the proliferation of equity and
Hmm.
equality.
Yeah, I'm so big on equity. I think like equality, we've come a long way. The discussion used to be more about equality. We got to be equal, but we're realizing that we're all starting from different starting points, right? I mean, there's there are some people and groups that are already so far ahead, others that are so far back, and so equality just doesn't help individuals and communities in those circumstances. And we've got to look at equity. And I think that's one way that I hope to approach everything, whether it's the law or supporting other people or looking at politics. Equity, diversity, listening to everybody, having everybody at the table is so important.
So you mentioned, and I'm gonna have to have you back on because you know this has been a great chat, and hopefully it'll be at a time when my daughter hasn't woken me up at 4:30 a.m. in the
Definitely.
morning, where I'm kind of like I'm drinking iced coffee at 5:17 p.m. So, anyways,
Oh,
but
thank
you
you for
mentioned
having me, Robert. Really, it's been a great discussion.
it has been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you so much. Now, last question for you though. You were born in America, and you said that you'd like to be the president of the United States. Is that still on the horizon?
No, I don't think so. I have
What about
I
prime
have
minister?
I people often tell that to me, and they say, "What about party leader?" And I say, "I don't speak French, and I don't plan to speak French either. Though I did take it up to grade 12, so I could pick it up one day. But I am so passionate about helping people, and um, I'm an individual who strongly believes that being in a position of power doesn't always mean that you can always change things as much as you think you can. Now, of course, being president, there's a lot of things in your control. Being a prime minister, so many things that are within your control, but there's an entire system ahead of you that you have to change. And even a 4-year term or 5-year term or even 8-year term or even longer would just never be enough to do probably all the things that need to be changed. And there's always bureaucracy that gets in the way. And we know people within certain parties that try to rise up, who try to change things, and then they get silenced. And so I passionately believe, I'd like to get perhaps into politics one day, but I don't want to make it my life. I strongly believe that I can have an impact as an individual helping people. And I think I'm looking very forward to being a lawyer and being able to have that freedom. I don't want to be tied down by bureaucracy or by politics, to support people who really need it, to be a voice, to speak what I want, and not feel that I have to abide by party norms, or something that could potentially silence me. I am an individual, and I have supported the Greens. I am a BC Greens member as well as a federal Greens member, and I know that they've given me a lot of the freedom to speak on issues as I wish, which is something that I absolutely enjoy, having the freedom to talk on the issues that I'm passionate about. They don't always necessarily have to align with everything that the party believes, but it's given me that freedom where I can speak and speak from my experience, of course, to better this country for everybody.
Wonderful. Well, you have my vote. Wherever you go, you just let me know. And
Thank you, Robert. No, I really appreciate that.
well, Lila, I mean, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing with us these issues, and in a way that it's approachable for myself, because I don't know a whole lot about these things, and I appreciate your insight. So thank you so much. We're going to have you back on to talk about law and how that could
Definitely.
change society, right? I mean, in terms of the things that you speak about, social justice. I know you're going to go places. So if you don't mind
Thank
my
you so
asking,
much, Robert. Yes, go
yeah,
ahead.
because boy, and first of all, you said that you want to make an impact. You already have made an impact. You're going to
Thank
continue to
you.
make an impact, and I'm excited by it. So, my question is, how old are you, if you don't mind
I
answering?
I am 22. Yeah. So
20. That gives me such encouragement and hope. Because when
oh,
I was
thank you.
22, I was a lost soul. So
Oh no.
yeah,
Yes, you
yeah.
can. Yes, yeah, don't underestimate the power that youth can have, but you can always, turn your life around at any point in time. You just have to have the willpower, however old or young you are. So,
I
yeah.
what a beautiful message. You can make an impact at any time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Robert. It's been such a pleasure. You're an amazing interview, and we had such fruitful discussions. So, thank you.
Well, I look forward to having you on again soon. And thank
Definitely.
you, Forgettable Vendetta, for
Hmm.
helping us with the some of the information there. This person helped me the other day with I couldn't remember Isaac Newton's first name. And I was like,
Oh,
that Newton guy. And then he messaged Isaac. I'm like, oh, you're great. Okay. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
you as well. Thank you.